The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a life-altering storm. I sat on a thrift store leather sofa in my daughter Maya's Lincoln Park apartment, watching the man who wanted to marry her pace the floor like he was measuring it for a renovation he hadn't yet paid for. Harrison Vane III was a man of precise angles, crisp lines in his Italian suit, a sharp, sculpted jawline, and eyes that always seemed to be looking for the price tag on everything, including people. He stopped near the window, the Chicago skyline shimmering behind him, and turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the smile a predator gives a cornered animal right before the final strike, but Harrison didn't realize who was really in the corner. He thought he was looking at a weary, middle-aged man from the South Side who smelled like diesel and old grease. He didn't know he was looking at the man who held his family's entire legacy in the palm of his hand. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks solid gold, probably an heirloom from a grandfather who actually worked for a living. Gabriel, he started, using my full name, with a patronizing weight, as if he were teaching a child to a new word. I want to be transparent with you. Maya and I have been looking at the guest list for the wedding at the Drake. My parents have expectations. We're talking about senators, the board of the Art Institute, and the senior partners from my firm. This isn't just a party, it's a foundational event for our future. He paused, letting the words foundational event hang in the air like a threat. Then came the blow. We've done the math, and for your side of the family to be properly represented, to really keep up with the standard we're setting, we're going to need a contribution of $75,000 by Friday. If we can't secure the Gold Coast Ballroom by then, I'm afraid we'll have to reconsider if this wedding can even happen this year, or at all. Maya, my sweet, brilliant girl who had inherited her mother's empathy and my stubbornness, gasped from the kitchen doorway. Her face went pale, her hands trembling as she held a tea towel. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of shame and desperation. She thought I was a simple branch manager at a local community bank in Bridgeport. She thought $75,000 was more money than I'd seen in a decade. What she didn't know was that my company, Sterling Capital Group, had cleared that much in profit while Harrison was still picking out his silk tie that morning. But I didn't say a word. I just sat there in my faded Carhartt jacket and work boots, nodding slowly, letting him believe he'd just broken me. I didn't know it yet, but that 60-second silence was the beginning of the end for the House of Vane. The journey to that moment hadn't started in a boardroom. It started 25 years ago on the docks of the Chicago River. My late wife, Sarah, and I had started Sterling Capital with nothing but a used laptop and a belief that working-class families deserved a fair shake from lenders who didn't look down their noses at them. We'd built it brick by brick, staying under the radar, never moving out of our modest bungalow in Bridgeport even as the zeros in our bank account started to multiply. I liked the quiet. I liked the fact that when I walked into a neighborhood diner, people saw Gabe Sterling the neighbor, not Gabriel Sterling the billionaire. I wanted Maya to grow up with that same groundedness. I wanted her to earn her way, which she did, graduating top of her class from UChicago and landing a high-level marketing job on her own merits. But then she met Harrison. I remember the first time she brought him home 8 months ago. Harrison's charcoal-collared Porsche Chin Tramway Moat looked like a spaceship parked in our neighborhood of brick bungalows and weathered porches. He stepped out of the car, looking around with a squint as if the very air of Bridgeport was too thick for his refined lungs. I was under my Heingen Tam Ford F Motrumnum Mui at the time, changing the oil. My hands were black with grime when I slid out to greet him. I offered a hand, and the way he looked at it with a flicker of genuine physical revulsion told me everything I needed to know about him. He barely touched my fingers. A quick, limp contact before he wiped his hand on a silk handkerchief. "So, you're the father," he had said, his voice dripping with a casual, polished arrogance. "Maya mentioned you work in banking. I assume. Back office? Logistics? Something like that," I'd replied, wiping my hands on a rag and catching the look of apology on Maya's face. She'd told him I worked at the bank, a vague term she used because she didn't want him to think she was a trust fund kid. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not what her father owned. It was a noble sentiment, but Harrison Vane III didn't value nobility. He valued assets. Over the next few months, I watched him systematically chip away at Maya's confidence. He'd make helpful suggestions about her wardrobe, tell her which friends were socially advantageous to keep, and drop subtle hints about how my quaint lifestyle was a hurdle they'd eventually have to overcome. The tension peaked at an engagement dinner his parents hosted at their Lake Forest estate, a massive stone fortress that screamed old money, even though I knew for a fact the roof had a lien on it. Harrison's father, Harrison Vane, too, was a man who lived in the shadow of a greatness he never quite achieved, spending his days at the country club and his nights worrying about his dwindling liquidity. His mother, Eleanor, looked at my off-the-rack suit like it was a contagious disease. "Gabriel," she had said during the third course, leaning in with a smile that felt like a razor blade. We were so surprised to hear Maya didn't have a trust. In our circles, it's quite standard, but I suppose we all have different priorities. "I hear your neighborhood is very authentic. Lots of history there, I imagine?" "It's a neighborhood of workers, Eleanor," I'd said, taking a sip of the wine that Harrison had spent 10 minutes bragging about. "People who build things." Harrison III had laughed then, a sharp, barking sound that silenced the table. "Well, someone has to do the building, I suppose. But Maya is a Vane now, or she will be soon. We're moving her into the world of architects, not the people who haul the bricks. That's why the wedding is so important, Gabrielle. It's her debut. It's her chance to show everyone she's moved past her. Humble origins." I felt Maya's hand tighten under the table. She was hurt, but she was also brainwashed. Harrison had convinced her that his world was the only one that mattered, and that she was lucky to be invited into it. He'd made her feel small, so he could feel like a giant. I stayed quiet then, too, even as I watched them mock the very values I'd spent my life instilling in her. I watched Harrison order for her, talk over her, and treat her like a beautiful piece of furniture he was planning to restore. I realized then that I couldn't just tell Maya who Harrison was. I had to show her. And more importantly, I had to show Harrison what happens when you try to bully a man who doesn't need to bark to prove he has teeth. Back in the apartment, Harrison was still looking at me, waiting for a response to his $75,000 demand. "I know it's a lot," he said, his voice softening into a fake sympathy that was even more insulting than his anger. "But think of it as an investment in Maya's social standing. If you can't come up with it, we might have to scale back. Maybe a small ceremony at your local parish? We could do the reception at that little Italian place you like, Vito's. It might be more within your comfort zone." He shared a smirk with the Chicago skyline. Vito's was a hole-in-the-wall pasta joint where I took Maya every Friday night. It was her favorite place in the world, but Harrison made it sound like a soup kitchen. "Vito's is a good place," I said quietly, standing up. My knees popped a reminder of the years I'd spent actually working for my wealth. "But I understand, Harrison. You want the best for my daughter." "Exactly," Harrison said, puffing out his chest. "I'm glad you're being realistic. Friday, Gabriel. Wire the funds or we'll have to make some very difficult phone calls to our guests." Maya followed me to the door, her eyes wet. "Dad, please. You don't have to do this. I'll talk to him. We can have a smaller wedding." "I don't care about the Gold Coast." I cupped her face, my heart aching for the girl who was caught between a father she loved and a monster she thought she needed. "Don't worry about the money, Maya. I've always told you. I'll take care of the things that matter. You just focus on being happy." "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I'm sure," I said. As I walked to my truck, I felt a cold, familiar fire starting to burn in my chest. Harrison wanted a foundational event. I was going to give him one. I pulled out my phone and hit a speed dial I hadn't used in months. "Julian," I said when my head of compliance answered, "I need a full forensic audit on the Vane family holdings. Specifically the mortgage on the Lake Forest estate and the lines of credit for Vane Logistics. I want to know every penny they owe, every late payment they've ever made, and exactly which bank holds their debt." "Sterling Capital holds about 60% of their commercial paper, sir," Julian replied, his voice professional and devoid of surprise. "We acquired the debt package from Midwest National last quarter during the merger. Is there a problem?" "Not a problem, Julian," I said, looking at the glowing windows of Maya's apartment in the rearview mirror. "A solution. I want a meeting with the board of directors Monday morning. And tell legal to look up the moral turpitude and character clauses in their primary mortgage agreement. I think the Vanes are about to find out that their social standing is built on a foundation of sand." I drove back to Bridgeport, passing the steel mills and the rows of humble houses where people worked hard and treated their neighbors with respect. Harrison thought I was a nobody because I didn't flaunt my wealth. He thought he could extort me because he assumed my background made me weak. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Money can buy you a seat at the table, but it can't buy you the soul required to keep it. What happened next changed everything. I spent the rest of the night in my home office, surrounded by the family photos Harrison found so quaint. Bye-bye, Kong Am. I had a digital file open on my screen that made my blood run cold. The Vanes weren't just arrogant, they were desperate. They were living on borrowed time, and borrowed money, using Maya's marriage as a way to project an image of stability they didn't actually possess. But there was something else. A hidden transaction, buried deep in the Vane logistics ledgers, that suggested Harrison wasn't just looking for a wedding contribution. He was looking for a way to cover a massive illegal shortfall before his partners found out. I leaned back in my chair, the light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. Harrison had tried to use my daughter's happiness as a bargaining chip to save his own skin. He had underestimated the poor bank employee from Bridgeport, and in doing so, he had handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy him. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Maya. "Dad, Harrison just told me he's handling the guest list. He said he's sorry if he was harsh earlier, but he's just stressed about the future. He really does love me, right?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. Because I knew that by Friday, the man Maya thought she loved would be replaced by the man he truly was, and the Vane family would be looking for a new place to live. But as I closed the file, a new thought entered my mind, one that chilled me even more than the financial fraud. If Harrison was this desperate for $75,000, what else was he capable of? I looked at the photo of Maya on her graduation day and made a silent vow. He wanted to talk about investments? Fine. I was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to shortchange Gabriel Sterling. Monday morning in Chicago has a specific kind of energy, a frantic, metallic pulse that echoes off the L tracks and vibrates through the glass of the Loop's skyscrapers. I traded my Carhartt for a bespoke charcoal suit that hadn't seen the light of day in months. I didn't drive my truck. I took a car service to a private entrance of the Sterling building, a limestone giant that I'd purchased a decade ago when the market was bleeding. Most people in this city saw the name Sterling Capital Group and thought of a faceless conglomerate. They didn't realize it was named after a woman who used to pack my lunch in a Tupperware container before I headed off to work the docks. I stepped into the executive boardroom on the Nummu Bourne floor, and the room went silent. These were men and women who managed billions, yet they stood up when I walked in. I hadn't been in the office for 3 weeks. I'd told Maya I was taking some personal days from the bank branch, but the engine of my empire had never stopped turning. Julian, my head of compliance, was already at the head of the table, his face illuminated by the blue light of a projected spreadsheet. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew me well enough to know that when I showed up in person, someone was usually about to have a very bad day. "The Vane audit is complete, Gabrielle," Julian said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "It's worse than we thought. Vane Logistics hasn't turned a profit in 18 months. They've been shuffling funds between offshore accounts to cover interest payments on the Lake Forest estate. But the real kicker is Harrison III. He's been borrowing from the firm's employee pension fund to maintain his lifestyle. He's currently $68,000 in the hole, and his partners are starting to ask questions." I sat at the head of the table, the weight of the information settling into my bones like lead. Harrison wasn't just an arrogant prick. He was a thief. He was demanding $75,000 from me not for a ballroom, but to replace the money he'd stolen before he ended up in a federal jumpsuit. He was trying to buy his freedom with my daughter's future. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. Somewhere out there, Maya was probably picking out floral arrangements, thinking she was building a life with a man of honor. The betrayal tasted like ash. I realized then that Harrison didn't just underestimate my bank account, he underestimated my memory. You see, I've spent 25 years being the invisible man. When Sarah and I started this, we made a pact. We'd seen what wealth did to the families in the North Shore, how it turned children into monsters and marriages into business mergers. We wanted Maya to know the value of a dollar, because she'd seen how hard it was to earn one. When Sarah got sick, she made me promise that I wouldn't let the money swallow our daughter. "Let her find herself in the real world, Gabe," she'd whispered in those final days. "Let her find a man who loves the girl from Bridgeport, not the Harris to Sterling Capital." I had kept that promise. I'd lived a double life that would make a spy tired. I'd attended Maya's soccer games in a dusty Ford, hosted graduation parties with domestic beer and grilled hot dogs, and watched her work 3 jobs in college to pay for books I could have bought 10,000 times over. I was so proud of the woman she had become, independent, fierce, and kind. But in my quest to keep her grounded, I'd accidentally left her unprotected. I'd made her the perfect target for a predator like Harrison Vane III. He saw a girl with an elite education and a struggling father, and he thought she was an easy mark, someone he could mold, someone whose working-class guilt he could exploit. The early warning signs had been there all along, and I cursed myself for ignoring them. I remembered a dinner 4 months ago, shortly after they got engaged. We were at a steakhouse in River North, Harrison's choice, of course. The waiter, a young kid who looked like he was working his way through school, accidentally brought Harrison a Cabernet instead of the Bordeaux he'd ordered. It was a simple mistake, the kind of thing any decent person would shrug off. But Harrison's face had transformed. The charming mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "Do you have any idea what this bottle costs?" Harrison had hissed, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying kind of cruelty. "I don't pay for your incompetence. I pay for a standard. If you can't handle a simple drink order, maybe you should go back to whatever trailer park spawned you." The waiter had blanched, stuttering an apology. Maya had looked horrified, reaching out to touch Harrison's arm. "Harrison, it's fine. Really. It was just a mistake." He'd shaken her hand off, his eyes fixed on the waiter. "It's not fine, Maya. People like this need to understand their place. If you don't demand excellence, you settle for mediocrity. That's the problem with your empathy, it's just a lack of standards." He'd spent the rest of the night lecturing her on how people of their station had to be firm with the service class. And the most painful part? Maya had eventually gone quiet, nodding slowly, her spirit dimming right in front of me. She'd started to believe that his cruelty was just a byproduct of his success. "Gabrielle?" Julian's voice snapped me back to the present. "What do you want to do? We can pull the credit lines today. We can have the foreclosure papers on Harrison II's desk by lunch tomorrow." "No," I said, my voice cold. "That's too fast. If we strike now, Harrison III will play the victim. He'll tell Maya that a big, bad corporation is ruining his family, and she'll run to his side to comfort him. I don't want to just break him financially. I want her to see the rot in his soul. I want her to be the one who walks away." "Then what's the move?" "We give him exactly what he asked for," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "He wants $75,000? Send it. But don't wire it from a personal account. Have one of our subsidiary shell companies, Bridgeport Logistics, issue a formal business loan document, high interest, short term, with a character clause attached. Make it look like I'm scraping the bottom of my retirement barrel to help him. I want him to feel like he's successfully extorted me. I want him to get comfortable. Arrogant men are at their most dangerous to themselves when they think they've already won." I left the office and headed to a small coffee shop near Maya's office in the West Loop. I'd asked her to meet me for a quick lunch, and when she walked in, she looked exhausted. The wedding planning, or rather, the Harrison orchestrated performance of a wedding, was draining the life out of her. She sat down, and before she could even say hello, her phone chimed. She glanced at it, and I saw her flinch. "Is everything okay?" I asked, pushing a cup of coffee toward her. "It's Harrison," she sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's upset because I didn't book the specific calligrapher his mother wanted. She's from London, Dad. It's $8,000 just for the invitations." I told him it was insane, and he told me that I'm thinking small again, that I need to stop acting like I'm still living in a bungalow in Bridgeport. "And what do you think?" I asked, watching her closely. "I think I miss our Friday nights at Vito's," she said, her voice small and filled with a longing that nearly broke me. "I think I miss when life wasn't about standards and expectations. But Harrison says this is just what it takes to build a legacy. He says he's doing this for us." "Maya, listen to me," I said, leaning across the table. "A legacy isn't built on invitations and ballrooms. It's built on how you treat people when nobody is watching. Does Harrison treat you better when nobody is watching?" She didn't answer. She just stared into her coffee. That silence was my answer. It was the sound of a girl realizing she was in a gilded cage, but the cage door was still locked, and Harrison held the key. "He's just stressed, Dad. His family's business is going through a transition. He's under a lot of pressure to maintain their image. Image is a fragile thing, Maya, especially when it's built on someone else's money." Before she could ask what I meant, Harrison himself walked into the shop. He must have tracked her phone. He didn't look at the other patrons. He walked straight to our table, like he owned the square footage we were occupying. He didn't even acknowledge me at first. He just looked at Maya's coffee cup. "Paper cups, Maya? Really? We have a meeting with the caterer in 20 minutes. You should be hydrating, not filling yourself with cheap caffeine." Then he turned to me, his eyes flicking over my suit. I'd purposely chosen an old, slightly ill-fitting one from the back of my closet for this meeting, keeping the bank employee ruse alive. "Gabrielle, I assume you're here to discuss the contribution? Friday is approaching." "I've got the money, Harrison," I said, keeping my voice humble. "I had to take out a high-interest loan against my pension, and the terms are a bit restrictive. but I'll have the 75,000 for you by the end of the week." Harrison's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He didn't acknowledge the sacrifice I just described. He simply nodded, as if it were his birthright. "Good. It's for the best. You wouldn't want to be the reason Maya's big day is a disappointment to everyone who matters." He leaned in then, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for me, but I knew Maya could hear it. "You're doing the right thing, Gabriel. In our world, you either pay the price of admission or you watch from the sidewalk. I'm glad you finally realized which one you are." He grabbed Maya's arm not roughly, but with a possessive firmness that made my skin crawl. "Come on, sweetheart. We're late. And Gabriel, try to get a better suit for the rehearsal dinner. We're having it at the Union League Club. They have a dress code that, well, let's just say they don't make exceptions for working families." As they walked out, Harrison threw a casual, dismissive wave over his shoulder. I sat there, my hands curled into fists under the table. He thought he'd just won. He thought he'd successfully bullied a tired old man into mortgaging his future for a lie. What he didn't know was that the $75,000 I was sending him wasn't a gift. It was a GPS tracker. Every cent of that money was marked, and by the time Harrison realized it, he'd already be walking into the trap I'd set. I watched through the window as he led Maya to his Porsche. He said something to her, and she looked down at her feet, her shoulders slumped. He laughed and patted her cheek, a gesture that was more like a master praising a dog than a man loving a woman. What happened next changed everything. I saw Harrison pull out his phone as he got into the driver's seat. He was smiling a genuine, triumphant smile. He made a quick call, and even from 20 feet away, I could see the frantic, greedy energy radiating off him. My phone buzzed. A message from Julian. "Gabriel, we just tracked a massive transfer out of Harrison III's personal account to a private gambling junket in Macau. It happened 2 minutes after he left the coffee shop. He didn't just steal from the pension fund, sir. He's a degenerate. He's trying to double the loan you just gave him before Friday." I felt a cold shiver of realization. Harrison wasn't just desperate. He was spiraling. And he was taking my daughter down with him. But there was one more thing in Julian's message that made my heart stop. "Also, Gabriel, we found a second name on the Vane Logistics secret ledger. Someone Harrison has been paying off for months. You aren't going to believe who it is." I stared at the name on the screen, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The betrayal wasn't just coming from the Vanes. It was coming from inside the one place I thought was safe. I realized then that this wasn't just about a wedding or a mortgage. This was a war for Maya's soul, and I was fighting people I didn't even know were my enemies. What happened next changed everything. I whispered to the empty coffee shop. I stood up, the humble bank employee persona vanishing, replaced by the man who had built an empire on the blood and sweat of the underestimated. The Vanes wanted to play games with my family? Fine. But they were about to find out that in the city of Chicago, you never, ever bet against the man who knows where the bodies are buried. The name on the screen felt like a physical blow, a sharp intake of cold air that stayed trapped in my lungs. Silas Vance. It wasn't a name I expected to see in the dark, oily corners of the Vane family's financial rot. Silas was more than my chief operating officer. He was the man I had handpicked from a community college career fair 20 years ago. I'd mentored him, stood as the best man at his wedding, and held his son at his baptism. He was the only person outside of my immediate circle who knew the full extent of my wealth and the strategic silence I kept about it. Seeing his name on a secret ledger for Vane Logistics, the very company currently trying to bleed me dry, didn't just hurt. It felt like the foundation of my life was being dismantled by the very hands I'd taught to build. I sat in my truck, the engine idling in the shadows of a West Loop alley, staring at the digital file. The payments to Silas were disguised as consulting fees, but the timing was surgical. They started exactly 2 weeks before Maya met Harrison at that charity gala at the Art Institute. My heart hammered against my ribs as the pieces began to click into place with a sickening clarity. Harrison hadn't met Maya by chance. He hadn't fallen for the smart, grounded girl from Bridgeport. He had been pointed toward her like a heat-seeking missile, guided by a man who knew exactly how much she was worth. Silas hadn't just betrayed me, he had sold my daughter to a predator. The betrayal sent me spiraling back to the early days, back to the small, cramped office above a laundromat in Bridgeport where Sarah and I started Sterling Capital. We had a single desk, a flickering fluorescent light, and a dream that was so simple it felt revolutionary. We wanted to give people a chance. I remember Sarah sitting there, her belly swollen with Maya, highlighting spreadsheets by hand because we couldn't afford the software. She used to say, "Gabe, Money is like fire. It can keep a family warm, or it can burn the whole house down. We have to make sure our daughter knows how to handle the flame. When Sarah died, the light in our house didn't just go out. It was replaced by a cold, echoing silence that I tried to fill with work and overprotection. I became obsessed with keeping Maya normal. I wanted her to have the childhood Sarah and I never did one, not defined by the struggle for the next meal, but also not corrupted by the entitlement of the North Shore. I thought I was being a good father by hiding the billions. I thought I was protecting her by letting her think her dad was just a middle manager with a pension and a rusty truck. But as I sat in that alley, I realized I'd left her defenseless. I'd sent her into a world of wolves without telling her she was the biggest prize in the forest. I closed the laptop and drove toward the lake, needing the cold wind of Michigan Avenue to clear my head. I thought back to the first time I saw Silas and Harrison together. It was at the Sterling Capital Christmas party, the public one, the modest affair we held for the community bank employees. Silas had been there, playing the role of the loyal deputy, and Harrison had stopped by to pick up Maya. I remember Silas leaning in, whispering something to Harrison, and they both laughed a private, knowing sound. At the time, I thought Silas was just being polite to Maya's new boyfriend. Now, I realized I was watching the buyer and the broker celebrating a successful transaction. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the dark expanse of Lake Michigan, but Silas wasn't just helping Harrison with a loan. He was helping him orchestrate a hostile takeover of my family. The psychological tension began to gnaw at me. Every memory of the last 8 months was now tainted. I remembered the way Harrison's parents, Reginald and Eleanor, had treated Maya at that first dinner in Lake Forest. They hadn't just been snobbish. They had been tactical. They'd spent the evening subtly questioning her about my assets, my retirement plans, and whether Sterling Capital had succession insurance. They were checking the inventory. And Maya, God bless her, had defended me with a fierce loyalty that Harrison used against her. He'd told her that her father was noble, but limited, and that she needed the Vane family to help her reach her full potential. The manipulation was masterfully done. Harrison had isolated her by making her feel like her background was a burden she needed to outgrow. He'd convinced her that his arrogance was actually vision, and that his cruelty toward service staff was just high standards. He'd groomed her to be the perfect Vane polished, compliant, and most importantly, the key to the Sterling vault. By Tuesday morning, I was back in my poor man's suit, sitting in Silas Vance's office at the Sterling building. To the world, this was an executive suite. To me, it was a crime scene. Silas looked up from his desk, a wide, practiced smile spreading across his face. He looked every bit the successful Chicago businessman, expensive watch, perfectly tailored shirt, and an air of relaxed authority. Gabe. What a surprise, Silas said, standing up to offer a hand. I thought you were taking the week off to deal with the wedding madness. How's our girl Maya doing? The Drake Ballroom is a big undertaking. I didn't take his hand. I just sat down in the chair opposite him, the same chair where I'd sat a year ago, and told him he was like a brother to me. She's doing okay, Silas. Stressed. Harrison is. Demanding. He's asking for $75,000 by Friday. Silas didn't blink. He just let out a sympathetic sigh, leaning back in his chair. Well, that's the Vanes for you. They have a certain way of doing things. It's a lot of money, Gabe. Can you swing it? I know things have been tight with your retirement planning. The gall of the man was breathtaking. He knew exactly what was in my personal accounts. He knew $75,000 was what I spent on office supplies in a month. But he was playing the role, keeping the lie alive for his own benefit. I'm working on it, I said, leaning forward. Actually, I wanted to ask you about Vane Logistics. We hold some of their paper, don't we? For a split second, a fraction of a heartbeat, Silas's mask faltered. His eyes flickered toward his computer screen, then back to me. Vane? Yeah. We acquired some of their debt in the Midwest National merger. Standard commercial stuff. Why do you ask? I heard a rumor they're struggling. Pension fund issues, mostly. I'd hate for Maya to marry into a family that's about to go under. Silas laughed, but the sound was thin, like brittle glass. Oh, Gabe, you worry too much. The Vanes are old money. They've been in Chicago since the fire. They have reserves we can't even imagine. Harrison is a shark. He knows what he's doing. You should trust him. He's the best thing that ever happened to Maya's social standing. Is he? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Because I'm starting to think Harrison isn't the one running the show. I'm starting to think someone else is pulling the strings. Someone who knows where the money is hidden. Silas's smile turned into a thin, hard line. The warmth in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, corporate hostility. I don't follow you, Gabe. If you have concerns about the bank's assets, we should call a formal meeting. But if this is about your future son-in-law, maybe you should take it up with him at the rehearsal dinner. I stood up, adjusting my cheap tie. I'll do that, Silas. But before I go, I have a question. How much is a soul going for these days? Does it come in installments, or did the Vanes pay you a lump sum up front? Silas didn't answer. He just stared at me, his face a mask of cold, calculating stone. I walked out of his office, and as I passed his secretary, I felt the eyes of a dozen people on me. They saw a man in a poorly fitted suit, a man they thought was a relic of a simpler time. They didn't see the hurricane that was about to hit the building. I spent the afternoon at a small park in Bridgeport, watching a group of kids play baseball on a gravel diamond. This was where Sarah and I used to bring Maya. This was the world Harrison wanted her to forget. My phone buzzed a text from Harrison. Gabrielle, the wire hasn't hit the caterer's account yet. Time is running out. Don't make me explain to my parents why your family is the reason for the delay. It's embarrassing for Maya. The embarrassment loop. It was his favorite weapon. He didn't just want the money. He wanted me to feel the weight of my supposed failure. He wanted Maya to see me as the anchor dragging her down. But as I watched those kids play, I realized something. Harrison wasn't just a gambler. He was a coward. He was hiding behind his family's name because he had nothing of his own. And Silas was the architect of a house of cards, and I was the only one who knew where to pull the first card. I sent a quick reply to Harrison. The funds are being processed. They'll be there by Friday morning. I'll see you at the venue for the final walkthrough. Then, I called Julian. Julian, forget the foreclosure papers for now. I want you to look into the character clauses in Silas Vance's employment contract. And I want a private investigator on Harrison's parents. I want to know what they're doing with the consulting fees Silas has been sending them. Sir? Julian's voice was sharp with surprise. You think he's paying the parents too? I think the Vanes are a hollow shell, and Silas is using them to launder money out of sterling capital before I retire. They aren't just marrying Maya for the money, they're using her as a legal shield. If she's a Vane, they think I won't sue them into the ground when I find out the truth. I hung up and looked at the Chicago skyline, the Sears Tower, now the Willis, though I'd never call it that, reaching into the clouds. It was a city built on secrets and steel. Harrison and Silas thought they were the masters of both. They thought they had me cornered in my own quaint little life. What happened next changed everything. As I was walking back to my truck, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up alongside me. The back window rolled down just an inch. I didn't see a face, only a hand tossing a manila envelope onto the grass at my feet. Mr. Sterling, a voice whispered from the darkness of the car. You aren't the only one Harrison Vane is stealing from. Check the photos. You'll find out what he really does on those business trips to Macau. And you'll find out who was on the plane with him. The SUV sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the humid air. I picked up the envelope, my heart pounding. I pulled out a stack of high-resolution photos. There was Harrison, looking disheveled and frantic at a high-stakes baccarat table. But it was the person sitting next to him, her hand on his arm, that made the world go black for a second. It was Eleanor Vane, Harrison's mother. But she wasn't just watching him gamble. She was handing him a stack of chips that looked like they were worth more than the $75,000 I'd just loaned him. And behind them, partially obscured by a cocktail waitress, was a face I recognized instantly. It was Maya's best friend, Sarah, the girl she'd known since kindergarten. The girl I'd treated like a second daughter. Sarah wasn't in Macau for a vacation. She was there with them. I realized then that the rot didn't just stop at Silas. It had reached into the very heart of Maya's support system. I wasn't just fighting a fiancé and a business partner. I was fighting a conspiracy of everyone Maya loved. What happened next changed everything. I looked at the final photo in the deck, a shot of Harrison and Sarah in a very compromised position on a private balcony. The betrayal was total. The trap was set. But as I stood there in the quiet of my old neighborhood, I realized I wasn't just going to stop a wedding. I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. And the best part? I was going to let Harrison Vane III hold the match. The walk into the lobby of the Drake Hotel usually feels like stepping into a more refined era of Chicago history, all gold leaf, marble, and the quiet hum of old money. But that Wednesday afternoon, it felt like walking into a gallows. I was wearing my most father of the bride suit, a charcoal wool blend from a department store sale that I'd had tailored just enough to look respectful but not successful. I carried a manila envelope tucked under my arm, the weight of it feeling like a live grenade. Inside wasn't just the $75,000 Harrison had demanded. It was the beginning of the paper trail that would lead him to a prison cell. Harrison was standing near the grand staircase, looking like the prince of a kingdom that was actually in probate. He was flanked by his mother, Eleanor, and Sarah, Maya's best friend, since the days of pigtails and scraped knees. Seeing Sarah there, laughing at something Harrison whispered in her ear, made the bile rise in my throat. I'd paid for Sarah's summer camp when her parents were struggling. I'd bought her a laptop for college when hers crashed. To see her now, leaning into the man who was systematically destroying my daughter's life, was a level of betrayal that made the financial fraud look like a parking ticket. "Gabriel, you're late," Harrison called out, his voice echoing through the vaulted lobby. He checked his Patek Philippe with a flourish, making sure I saw the gold glint. "The event coordinator is already upstairs in the Gold Coast ballroom. We don't have time for a scenic tour." "Traffic on the Dan Ryan," I said, keeping my voice low and humble. I caught Maya's eye as she walked toward us from the concierge desk. She looked beautiful, but it was a brittle kind of beauty, her skin too pale, her smile too quick to disappear. She looked like a woman who was constantly bracing for an impact she couldn't see coming. "Dad," she whispered, pulling me into a hug. She smelled like the expensive perfume Harrison's mother had forced on her, a scent that didn't fit the girl who used to love the smell of rain and lake water. "You didn't have to come to the walkthrough. I know you're busy at the bank." "I wouldn't miss it, honey," I said, squeezing her hand. I felt the thinness of her fingers. She was losing weight. We moved upstairs to the ballroom, a massive expanse of crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Oak Street Beach. It was a room designed to intimidate, and Harrison was using it like a stage. He spent the next hour berating the florist about the height of the centerpieces and telling the lighting technician that the amber glow was too suburban. Every time he spoke, he looked at me, making sure I understood that this was a world I didn't belong in. "The $75,000, Gabrielle," Harrison said, pulling me aside as the women discussed silk versus satin linens near the window. "Do you have the check? The hotel needs the deposit cleared by 5 o'clock or we lose the weekend." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. "It's all there, Harrison. A cashier's check from Bridgeport Logistics. Like I said, it's a loan against my pension. The interest is steep, so I'm going to need you to be mindful of the repayment schedule." Harrison snatched the envelope, his fingers practically twitching with greed. He didn't even say thank you. He just peeked inside, saw the numbers, and a look of pure, predatory relief washed over his face. "Of course, Gabriel. Once the logistics merger goes through next month, I'll have more than enough to clear your little debt. Think of this as a bridge loan to your daughter's future." He patted my shoulder, a heavy, condescending gesture, and walked over to Sarah. I watched him lean in, his hand lingering just a second too long on the small of her back. She didn't flinch. She leaned back, a secret smile playing on her lips. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They weren't even trying to hide it from me anymore because they truly believed I was too stupid or too desperate to see it. They thought the poor bank employee was just happy to be in the room. What happened next changed everything. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. A text from Julian. "Gabrielle, check the ballroom's private balcony. We've got a directional mic in the floral arrangements. You're going to want to hear this." I waited until Harrison and Sarah stepped away toward the far end of the room, pretending to inspect the view of the lake. Maya was busy with Eleanor, arguing over the guest seating chart. I drifted toward a pillar, pulled out my wireless earbuds, and tapped into the Sterling Capital secure feed. "Is the money enough?" Sarah's voice came through, sharp and clinical. "It's enough to cover the pension shortfall," Harrison replied, his voice stripped of its polished charm. "The old man is a coward. He practically begged me to take it. He thinks he's saving Maya. He has no idea he's just funding our exit strategy." "And Maya?" Sarah asked. "She's a means to an end, Sarah. You know that. Once the wedding is over and the Sterling Trust is legally merged with the Vane estate, we'll have the liquidity to move the operations to the Caymans. She'll get a nice settlement in the divorce and we'll be gone. She's too fragile to fight back anyway. She'll just retreat to Bridgeport and cry into her father's greasy work shirts." They laughed, a cold, hollow sound that seemed to rattle the crystals of the chandeliers above me. I looked at Maya across the room. She was holding a swatch of white silk, looking at it with such hope, such innocent longing for a happy life. My heart didn't just break. It hardened into a diamond. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a cheating fiancé and a fraudulent businessman. I was dealing with a pair of sociopaths who were planning to strip my daughter of her dignity and her future, and then discard her like a piece of trash. I didn't know it yet, I whispered into the mic, though no one could hear me. But that laugh was the last happy sound Harrison Vane would ever make. The afternoon escalated into a dinner at a high-end French bistro nearby. Harrison insisted on ordering for everyone, choosing the most expensive tasting menu and 3 bottles of vintage Burgundy. He was celebrating. He thought he'd just secured his freedom with my $75,000. He spent the meal telling amusing stories about his family's history, making sure to contrast their legacy with the short-term nature of working-class families. "It's about endurance, isn't it, Eleanor?" Harrison said, raising his glass. "Some families are built to last centuries. Others, well, they're just the support staff for history." He looked directly at me when he said, "support staff." Maya looked down at her plate, her fork trembling. She knew he was insulting me, and the guilt of it was eating her alive. She thought I was enduring this humiliation for her. She didn't know I was enjoying it. I was a fisherman letting the shark take the bait deeper and deeper into its throat. "You're right, Harrison," I said, taking a slow sip of water. "Endurance is everything. But you know what they say in the bank, it's not the height of the building that matters, it's the depth of the foundation. If the foundation is rotten, the whole thing comes down, no matter how much gold leaf you put on the walls." The table went quiet. For a second, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Harrison's face. He looked at me, really looked at me, searching for a sign that I knew more than I was letting on. But I just smiled, the tired, slightly dim-witted smile of a man who didn't understand the complexities of the North Shore. "What a quaint metaphor, Gabriel," Eleanor said, breaking the tension with a forced laugh. "But let's talk about the rehearsal dinner. We really must insist on the Union League Club. I know the membership requirements are stringent. But Harrison's father can sponsor you as a guest. Just try to keep your stories about the neighborhood to a minimum. We wouldn't want to confuse the senators." The meal ended with Harrison handing the waiter a credit card that I knew, thanks to Julian's audit, was within $300 of its limit. He was living on the edge of a razor, and he was using my daughter as his balance pole. As we walked out to the valet, the humidity of the Chicago summer hanging heavy in the air, Harrison pulled Maya aside. I stood near my truck, watching them. He was whispering in her ear, his hand gripping her forearm a little too tightly. I saw her flinch, a tiny movement that most people would have missed, but I saw it. It was the flinch of a woman who was starting to realize her prince was a jailer. Sarah walked over to me, her eyes bright with a false, sickening warmth. "Mr. Sterling, you're so generous. Maya is so lucky to have a dad who would do anything for her. I hope you know how much this wedding means to her." "I know exactly what it means, Sarah," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "And I know exactly what everyone's contribution has been. You've been a real friend to this family." She blinked, the first crack in her armor appearing. She opened her mouth to speak, but Harrison called her over to his Porsche. "Come on, Sarah. We need to drop you off before we head to the jeweler." They drove off, leaving me and Maya standing on the sidewalk. The silence between us was heavy. Maya looked at the ground, her shoulders slumped. "Dad," she said, her voice small. "Yeah, honey? Do you think people can really change? Or are we just stuck being who we were born to be?" "I think people show you exactly who they are, Maya. The problem is we usually spend too much time trying to convince ourselves they're someone else." She looked up at me, and for a second I thought she was going to tell me everything, the fear, the doubt, the way Harrison treated her when the lights were low. But she just sighed and kissed my cheek. "I'll see you Friday at the rehearsal, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, Maya." I watched her walk toward her own car, the weight of the world on her back. As soon as she was out of sight, I pulled out my phone. "Julian, it's time. Harrison just used the $75,000 to pay off a gambling debt in Macau through a third-party wire. It's not in the pension fund. He's officially committed wire fraud. And I want the footage from the Drake lobby cameras, the part where he and Sarah think they're in a blind spot." "Got it, Gabriel. What about Silas? Call a board meeting for tomorrow morning at 8. Don't tell Silas. I want him to walk into a room and find his chair missing. And Julian, send a message to the Vane Logistics partners. Tell them Sterling Capital is calling in all commercial paper. Effective immediately." I got into my truck and sat there for a long time, the engine humming. The betrayal was complete. The escalation was over. Now, it was time for the collapse. But as I shifted into gear, a black car pulled up behind me. its high beams flashing 3 times. A signal. I rolled down my window. A man I'd never seen before, dressed in a plain black suit, stepped out of the car and handed me a burner phone. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, "there's one more person involved in the Macau transactions. Someone you haven't looked at yet. Answer the phone when it rings." The man walked back to his car and drove away before I could ask a single question. 10 seconds later, the burner phone in my hand started to vibrate. I answered it, and the voice on the other end made the hair on my arms stand up. "Gabriel," the voice whispered, "it's been a long time. You thought you were the only one who knew how to stay invisible, but you forgot that Sarah had a mother, and I've been watching the veins a lot longer than you have." I stared at the phone, the world tilting again. The conspiracy wasn't just about money and power. It was about a past I thought I'd buried 25 years ago. I didn't know it then, but the next 24 hours wouldn't just destroy the veins. They would force me to face the one secret I'd never told Maya, the secret that would either save her or make her hate me forever. The voice on the burner phone was like a ghost reaching out from a grave I'd spent 2 decades trying to keep sealed. Evelyn Thorne. She had been the lead bookkeeper at the first firm I ever worked, for the firm that went under right before I started Sterling Capital. She was also Sarah's mother. Not Maya's mother, but Sarah, the girl currently plotting to dismantle my daughter's life. The connection sent a cold shiver down my spine. I hadn't seen Evelyn in 20 years. Not since the day the investigators cleared me of any wrongdoing in that firm's collapse and laid the blame at the feet of the senior partners, one of whom had been a very young, very desperate Reginald Vane. "Evelyn," I whispered, the name feeling like sandpaper in my throat. "What are you talking about?" "What do you mean you've been watching them?" "Reginald didn't lose his fortune in the market, Gabriel." Evelyn's voice crackled, thin and sharp. "He lost it in the same place his son is losing it now. The Vanes have been a hollow shell since Matngin Chin Trum Chin Mui Tarm. They've survived by finding investors like you people, with more heart than sense, and bleeding them dry. But this time, they didn't just want the money. They wanted the name. They wanted to link their rotting legacy to the Sterling reputation to get a fresh line of credit from the New York banks." "And your daughter?" I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "Sarah has been like a second child to me." "Why is she doing this?" "Because she's her father's daughter," Evelyn said, and I could hear the heartbreak in her tone. "She thinks the Vanes are her ticket out of the working-class life I gave her. She thinks Harrison is going to take her to the Caymans. She doesn't realize he's going to leave her holding the bag just like he's going to leave Maya. Gabriel, they're planning something for the rehearsal dinner. Something meant to humiliate you so publicly that Maya will be forced to choose between her shameful father and the prestigious Vanes. Don't go in there as the man from Bridgeport. If you do, you'll lose her." The phone went dead. I sat in the dark of my truck, the sounds of the Chicago night muffled by the glass. I realized then that the escalation wasn't just about financial fraud. It was a multi-generational grudge. Reginald Vane hadn't forgotten that I was the one who survived the firm's collapse while he was forced to hide his debts for 20 years. He was using his son to take back what he thought I'd stolen from him. A future. Thursday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I didn't go to the bank branch. I went to the Sterling building. This time, I didn't use the private entrance. I walked through the front doors, past the security guards who did a double take at the man they usually saw in a Ford truck now wearing a 3-piece suit that cost more than their yearly salary. I didn't say a word as I stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the Nummoy Bornth floor. The doors opened, and the atmosphere in the executive suite shifted instantly. My secretary, a woman who had been with me since the beginning, stood up, her eyes wide. "Mr. Sterling, the board is in the conference room. Silas is. He's in there with them. He said you authorized a special session." "I did," I said, my voice like a serrated blade, "but not the one he thinks." I walked into the boardroom. Silas was at the head of the table, leaning back with a coffee, laughing at a joke one of the directors had made. He looked like a king in his counting house. When he saw me, his laugh died in his throat. The coffee cup hit the table with a sharp clack. "Gabe?" he stammered, his eyes darting to my suit, then to the manila envelope in my hand. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the church or something, right?" "The church is tomorrow, Silas," I said, walking to the opposite end of the table. Every director in the room stood up. "Today is about the bank. Specifically, it's about the $75,000 that was wired out of the Bridgeport Logistics account yesterday afternoon." Silas tried to regain his composure, but I could see the sweat beads forming at his hairline. "Right, the wedding loan. We discussed that. It's all handled, Gabe. No need to bring the board into a personal matter." It stopped being a personal matter when that money was used to settle a private debt with a gambling syndicate in Macau, I said, tossing the audit report onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping right in front of him. And it became a criminal matter when I found the offshore account where Vane Logistics has been funneling Sterling Capital's pension funds, the one with your name on the signature card, Silas. The silence in the room was absolute. The directors looked from the report to Silas, who had gone a sickly shade of gray. "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've been loyal to this firm for 20 years. I built this place with you." "You didn't build it, Silas. You managed it while I did the heavy lifting. And you got greedy. You thought because I lived a quiet life, I wasn't watching the books. You thought because I loved my daughter, I wouldn't notice you selling her to the highest bidder." I turned to the board. Effective immediately, Silas Vance is terminated for cause. Security is waiting outside to escort him from the building. Julian has the full dossier on the fraud. We're turning it over to the feds at noon. As the guards led a sobbing, protesting Silas out of the room, I felt no satisfaction. Only a cold, hollow weight. I'd lost a brother today, but the war was only half over. I turned back to Julian, who was standing by the window. "What about the Vanes?" I asked. "They just checked into the presidential suite at the Union League Club," Julian said. "Harrison is telling everyone that the generous contribution from his future father-in-law has secured the family's legacy. He's invited the press to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. He's calling it a merger of Chicago traditions." "He wants a show?" I said, looking out at the city. "I'll give him a show, but first, I need to see Maya." I found her at a bridal boutique in the Gold Coast. She was trying on her veil, surrounded by Eleanor Vane and Sarah. The room was filled with the scent of lilies and the fake, high-pitched chatter of socialites. When I walked in, the room went quiet. "Dad?" Maya asked, turning around. Her eyes widened as she took in my appearance. I wasn't in the work boots. I was the man she hadn't seen since she was a little girl, the man who looked like he owned the world. "What are you wearing? You look different." "Gabriel," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How lovely of you to join us. But this is really a women's affair. Perhaps you should go find Harrison? He's at the club, finalizing the seating." "I'm not here for Harrison, Eleanor," I said, walking over to Maya. I took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "Maya, I need you to come with me. Now." "Dad, I can't. We have the final fitting, and then the hair trial, and—" "Maya, look at me," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Do you trust me?" She looked into my eyes, and for a second, the brainwashing flickered. She saw the father who had held her when she had night terrors, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike on the gravel of Bridgeport. "Yes," she whispered. "Then come with me. Don't take the veil off. Just come." We walked out, leaving Eleanor and Sarah standing in a stunned silence. I drove her to a small, quiet park overlooking the harbor. We sat on a bench, the wind whipping her white veil around her shoulders like a trapped bird. "What is going on, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Harrison says you're stressed. He says you're acting out because you're worried about the money. He said he's taking care of you." "Harrison is a liar, Maya," I said, and I didn't sugarcoat it. "He didn't use that $75,000 for the ballroom. He used it to pay off a gambling debt. And he's not marrying you because he loves you. He's marrying you because his family is bankrupt, and they think they can use my company to bail themselves out." I pulled out the photos from the envelope, the shots of Harrison and Sarah in Macau. Maya took them, her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. She looked at the first one, then the second. A small, broken sound escaped her throat. "No," she whispered. "No, Sarah wouldn't. She's my best friend. She's been on their payroll for a year, Maya. Silas Vance was paying her to keep you in the Vane orbit. They've been grooming you. They wanted to isolate you from me so they could control the Sterling assets." Maya looked at the photo of Harrison and Sarah on the balcony, and I watched the light go out of her eyes. It was the most painful thing I've ever seen. My daughter, my beautiful kind girl, was being shattered in real time. She didn't cry. She just went still, a terrifying, crystalline stillness. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice sounding like it was coming from a long way away. "We have two choices," I said. "We can call the police now, cancel the wedding, and let them fade into the shadows. Or, we can go to that rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. We can let them think they've won. We can let Harrison stand up in front of his important friends and his press contacts, and then we can show the world exactly who the Vanes are." Maya looked out at the water for a long time. The wind caught her veil again, pulling it toward the lake. She reached up, unpinned it, and let the white lace fly away into the gray waves. She turned to me, and the girl from Bridgeport was gone. In her place was the Harris to Sterling capital, the woman I had tried to hide, but who was now the only one who could finish this. "I want to go to the dinner," she said, her voice hard as iron. "I want to see their faces when the foundation collapses." I took her home to Bridgeport that night. We sat in our old kitchen, eating cold pizza and talking until the sun started to peek over the horizon. I told her everything about Sarah's mother, about the Vane's history, and about the secret wealth I'd kept from her. I expected her to be angry about the lie, but she just hugged me. "I used to wonder why we lived here when you worked so hard," she said. "Now I know. You were trying to keep the fire from burning the house down. But Dad, it's okay. Let it burn. We'll build something better on the ashes." Friday evening arrived. The Union League Club was a fortress of tradition, filled with the scent of expensive cigars and the sound of a string quartet. Harrison was at the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by 3 men in suits that screamed, "Federal Government." He saw us walk in me in my bespoke suit, Maya in a stunning black dress that was the polar opposite of a wedding gown, and his smile faltered for just a second. "Gabrielle, Maya, you're late for your own rehearsal," Harrison said, stepping forward. He tried to take Maya's hand, but she pulled away, her eyes cold. He laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "A bit of pre-wedding nerves. And Gabrielle, look at you. Did you finally spend that pension money on a decent tailor?" "I didn't spend the pension money, Harrison," I said, my voice carrying across the quieted room. "I spent the interest. You see, I had a very interesting conversation with Silas Vance yesterday morning, and an even more interesting one with the FBI this afternoon." The room went deathly silent. The important guests started to edge away from Harrison like he was a ticking bomb. Eleanor Vane stepped forward, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage. "Gabrielle, really, this is hardly the time or place for your theatrics. If you're upset about the seating chart—" "It's not about the seating, Eleanor," Maya interrupted, her voice clear and cutting through the room like a diamond. "It's about the fact that Harrison has been sleeping with my best friend while using my father's money to pay off his gambling debts." She pulled out her phone and hit a button. Behind the podium where Harrison was supposed to give his speech, a large projection screen lowered. It was meant to show a montage of their romance. Instead, it showed the high-resolution photo of Harrison and Sarah on the Macau balcony, followed by the bank statement showing the wire transfer to the gambling junket. The gasp that went through the room was collective. Sarah, who was standing near the bar, dropped her glass. It shattered on the marble floor. A sharp, final sound. Harrison turned to the screen, his face going from pale to a terrifying, mottled purple. This is a fabrication," he shouted, turning to the guests. "She's hysterical. Her father is a low-level bank employee who's trying to extort us." "I'm not a bank employee, Harrison," I said, stepping into the light. I pulled a small gold-embossed card from my pocket and set it on the podium. It was my official ID as chairman of Sterling Capital Group. I own the bank. "And as of 4 o'clock today, Sterling Capital has purchased the outstanding debt on your father's estate, your family's logistics firm, and your personal lines of credit. You don't just owe me $75,000, Harrison. You owe me everything." What happened next changed everything. Harrison didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the man he had been mocking for 8 months. He saw the predator he had mistaken for prey. But as the first pair of handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists, courtesy of the important men in suits who were actually federal agents, he leaned in and whispered something that made my heart stop. "You think you won, Sterling?" Harrison hissed, a manic glint in his eye. "Look at your daughter. Look at what you've done to her. You didn't save her. You just made her like us." I turned to look at Maya. She was standing in the center of the room, the carnage of the Vane family legacy scattered at her feet. She wasn't crying. She was smiling, but it wasn't the smile of my daughter. It was a cold, triumphant smile that I'd seen in the mirror for 25 years. I realized then that in my effort to destroy the wolves, I had finally taught my lamb how to hunt. And as I watched her walk over to Sarah and whisper something that made the girl collapse in tears, I felt a new kind of fear. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge wasn't over. It was just changing shape. And the person I had to worry about now wasn't a Vane. It was the woman I had just created. The silence that followed the click of the handcuffs was more deafening than the screaming had been. Harrison was led out of the Union League Club, his head bowed, the arrogance that had been his armor for 8 months stripped away to reveal a terrified, hollow boy. The elite guessed the senators, the judges, The partners melted away into the Chicago night, like shadows retreating from a sudden light. They didn't want to be near the wreckage. In this city, social contagion is deadlier than the flu. I stood by the podium, my hand resting on the gold-embossed card that identified me as the man who had just dismantled a dynasty. I should have felt a sense of triumph. I had protected my daughter. I had exposed a thief. I had balanced the scales. But as I looked at Maya, standing in the center of that opulent, empty room, I felt a cold, creeping dread. She wasn't looking at the door where Harrison had disappeared. She was looking at Sarah, who was crumpled on a velvet settee, sobbing into her hands. Maya walked over to her, not with the comfort of a friend, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a judge approaching the bench. She stood over Sarah for a long moment, then reached down and tipped Sarah's chin up with one finger. "Did you think I wouldn't find out, Sarah?" Maya's voice was a low, melodic hum that made my skin crawl. "Did you think I was so blinded by love that I wouldn't notice my best friend suddenly wearing Cartier bracelets she couldn't afford?" "Maya, please," Sarah gasped, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. "They threatened me. Silas said if I didn't help them, they'd ruin my mother's reputation. They had files on her from the old firm." "And you believed them," Maya said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Because you're a coward. You traded 20 years of friendship for a seat at a table that was already rotting. You didn't just betray me, you underestimated me. And in my family, that's the only sin that isn't forgiven." Maya turned away from her, not even waiting for a response. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the girl I'd raised in Bridgeport, the girl who loved rainy days and Vito's pasta. But then she blinked, and that girl was gone. "What's next, Dad? The foreclosure on the Lake Forest estate starts Monday, right?" "Monday morning," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "The sheriff will serve the papers at Chin, Hong A.M. Make it Tarm." "Hong A.M., Maya said. "I want them to be eating breakfast when the world ends. I want Eleanor to have to pack her Chanel bags in front of the neighbors." She walked past me toward the exit, her black dress trailing on the marble like a funeral shroud. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge wasn't the end of the story. It was just the opening act for a much darker play. We drove back to Bridgeport in a silence that felt like a physical weight. I kept glancing at her, wanting to say something to tell her it was over, to tell her we could go back to being just us. But I knew that was a lie. You can't unsee the monster, and you can't unlearn how to kill it. Saturday morning brought a different kind of tension. I was in my home office, reviewing the final collapse of Vane Logistics, when Julian called. His voice was frantic, a sharp departure from his usual corporate cool. "Gabriel, we have a problem. A massive problem." "What is it? Did the feds let Harrison out?" "No, Harrison is tucked away in a holding cell. It's Silas. He didn't just go to the feds with the fraud. He went to the state's attorney with a whistleblower filing. He's alleging that Sterling Capital intentionally predatory lent to the Vanes with the express purpose of a hostile takeover to manipulate local logistics markets. He's claiming you used Maya as bait to orchestrate a financial hit." I felt the air leave the room. That's insane. I didn't even know who Harrison was when they started dating. "It doesn't matter what's true, Gabriel. It matters what Silas can prove. He has internal memos he forged using your digital signature discussing the Vane acquisition strategy dated 6 months ago, and he's leaked them to the Chicago Tribune. The headline just hit the digital edition. Billionaire banker accused of using daughter as pawn in corporate vendetta. I looked out the window at the quiet streets of Bridgeport. The world was about to descend on this house. What about our assets? The state's attorney has filed for an emergency freeze on all Sterling Capital personal and corporate accounts, pending a preliminary investigation. Gabriel, as of 10 minutes ago, you're broke. On paper, at least. I hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Silas hadn't just been a thief, he'd been a contingency planner. He knew that if I ever caught him, he needed a nuclear option. He'd turned my own secrecy against me. Because I'd spent 25 years hiding my wealth, any sudden reveal looked like a calculated move by a shadowy mastermind. I walked into the kitchen to find Maya staring at her laptop. She'd seen the headline. She didn't look scared. She looked focused. "They're saying you used me, Dad," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I didn't, Maya. You know I didn't. I didn't even know the Vanes held debt with us until Harrison demanded that money." "I know that," she said, closing the laptop. "But the world doesn't. Silas is good. He's playing the working man card. He's making himself the hero who exposed the secret billionaire. He's currently at a press conference in Daly Plaza. What happened next changed everything. I realized that my rock bottom wasn't the betrayal by Harrison or Silas. It was the realization that I had played right into their hands by trying to live two lives. I had tried to be the humble neighbor and the powerful tycoon, and in the gap between those two identities, Silas had found the space to plant a bomb. "I have to go down there," I said, grabbing my keys. "I have to face him." "No," Maya said, standing up. She looked at me with a terrifying clarity. "If you go down there, you're just a rich man defending his pile of gold. You're the villain Silas wants you to be. But I'm the pawn. I'm the victim in his story. He won't see me coming. Maya, stay out of this. It's dangerous. These people are desperate. They're desperate for money, Dad. I'm desperate for the truth. There's a secret in the Vane files that you missed." I spent all night looking at the offshore transfers Silas was making. He wasn't just paying Harrison's gambling debts. He was paying someone else. Someone in the state's attorney's office. She pulled a thumb drive from her pocket. Silas didn't flip for justice. He flipped because his partner told him it was the only way to keep the money they'd already stolen. "I'm going to Daly Plaza. Not to defend you, but to finish what we started." I watched her walk out the door, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. I was a man who could move markets, but I couldn't move my own daughter. I sat in that quiet kitchen, the house I'd bought with Sarah to keep us safe, and I realized that the walls were finally closing in. By hung PM, the news vans were lined up outside our bungalow. The secret billionaire of Bridgeport was the story of the year. I stayed inside, watching the live feed from Daly Plaza. Silas was at the podium, looking humble in a cheap windbreaker, surrounded by a swarm of microphones. "I loved Gabriel Sterling like a brother," Silas told the cameras, his voice cracking with practiced emotion. "But when I saw what he was doing, how he was using his own daughter's heart to destroy a legacy family like the Vanes just to satisfy an old grudge, I couldn't stay silent. He thinks money makes him God. He thinks he can hide in a modest house while he pulls the strings of the city." The crowd of reporters was shouting questions, the energy reaching a fever pitch. Suddenly, the camera shifted. A woman was pushing through the crowd. She was wearing a simple black dress and no jewelry. She looked small, fragile, and utterly exhausted. It was Maya. The reporters swarmed her, the flashes of their cameras like a lightning storm. Silas frozen, his eyes widening as she approached the podium. He tried to smile, to play the concerned uncle role. "Maya, sweetheart," Silas said into the mic, his voice amplified across the plaza. "I know this is hard for you. Your father has put you through so much, but you're safe now. The truth is out." Maya stepped up to the podium. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked directly at Silas. The silence that fell over the plaza was absolute. "You're right, Silas," Maya said, her voice clear and carrying across the speakers. "The truth is finally coming out. But you forgot one thing about the Sterling family. We don't just keep secrets. We keep receipts." She held up the thumb drive. "You said my father used me as a pawn. But this drive contains the communication logs between your private server and the lead investigator in the Vane audit. It shows the $50,000 consulting fee you paid to have the Vane debt flagged for acquisition 6 months before I ever met Harrison. You weren't exposing my father's plan, Silas. You were executing yours." The plaza exploded. Silas lunged for the drive, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You little bitch! You have no idea what you're doing!" Security tackled him before he could reach her, but the damage was done. The hero of the day had just tried to assault the victim on live television. But as the police led Silas away, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Reginald Vane stepped out. He wasn't in handcuffs. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had just watched his last obstacle be removed. He walked up to Maya, ignoring the reporters, ignoring the chaos. He leaned in and whispered something to her that the microphones didn't catch. Maya's face went pale, her hand dropping to her side. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and realization. Reginald turned to the cameras, his voice smooth and commanding. "My son may be a fool, and Silas Vance may be a thief, but the Vane family legacy does not end in a courtroom. Gabriel Sterling thinks he bought our debt. He should check the fine print on the Sterling Capital Charter, the charter his late wife Sarah signed 25 years ago." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I watched the screen. The fine print? Sarah and I had written that charter ourselves. What was he talking about? Reginald continued, "There is a clause regarding succession and ownership in the event of a moral turpitude claim against the chairman. If the chairman is found to have manipulated the bank's assets for personal vendettas, The controlling interest doesn't go to the board. It reverts to the primary creditor of the original founding loan. He smiled a slow, terrifying baring of teeth. And 25 years ago, Gabriel, who do you think provided the $10,000 anonymous seed loaned to Sarah Thorne to start Sterling Capital? It wasn't a bank. It was my father, Harrison Vane I. I don't just owe you money, Gabriel. According to your own charter, I own your bank. I stared at the television, the world finally, completely collapsing. I didn't know it then, but the hidden truth wasn't about Harrison or Silas. It was about Sarah, my wife, the woman I had worshipped, had built our empire on a foundation of vain money. She hadn't been a victim of the old firm's collapse. She had been the bridge. What happened next changed everything. I looked at the photo of Sarah on my desk, the woman I thought I knew. And then I looked at Maya on the screen, standing next to the man who was about to take everything we had. The reversal was complete. I was no longer the billionaire in the shadows. I was a man with no money, no company, and a daughter who was currently staring at a man who claimed to be her family's real benefactor. But as I reached for the phone to call Julian, it rang first. It was Evelyn Thorne, Sarah's mother. "Gabrielle," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't look at the charter. Look at Maya's birth certificate, the one I kept in the safety deposit box. The Vanes aren't trying to take your bank, Gabrielle. They're trying to take their granddaughter." The phone slipped from my hand. The revenge plan hadn't just begun. It had just been revealed as a 25-year-long trap, and I was the only one left inside. The world didn't just stop. It inverted. I sat on the floor of my home office, the phone still humming with a dead signal from Evelyn Thorne. Outside, the sirens of the news vans were a distant, mocking chorus. My life, the 25 years I'd spent building an altar to hard work, integrity, and the self-made dream wasn't just a lie. It was a curated exhibit in a museum owned by my worst enemy. Sarah, my light, my moral compass, had started our empire with Vane blood money. And Maya. The thought of Maya's blood being linked to the Vane lineage made my stomach turn with a physical, acidic revulsion. I didn't have time to grieve. I didn't have time to feel the soul-crushing weight of Sarah's betrayal. Reginald Vane was standing in Daly Plaza, inches away from my daughter, claiming her as his own to the entire city of Chicago. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I walked to the small floor safe hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the radiator, the one place I'd never let the auditors look. Not because of the money, but because it held the before life, the scraps of who Sarah and I were before we became Sterling Capital. I dialed Julian as I threw open the safe. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharpening into a single, jagged point of intent. "Julian, the accounts are frozen, but the Sterling private vault at the North Loop branch isn't under the corporate charter. It's a legacy account under Sarah's maiden name. Get there. Now. You need to find the original ledger from Motngin Chincham Chinmuitarm. Not the digital copy. The physical book with the blue cover." "Gabrielle, the feds are everywhere," Julian whispered, his voice tight with panic. "If I go there, they'll pin me as a co-conspirator." "Julian, listen to me," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "If Reginald takes that bank, you're out anyway. But if you find that ledger, we don't just survive. We bury them. Look for a handwritten entry dated October Moibornth. It won't be a loan. It'll be an escrow for silence." I hung up and pulled a weathered, yellowing envelope from the safe. Inside was the birth certificate Evelyn had mentioned. I gripped the paper, my eyes scanning the lines. Maya Rose Sterling. Father, Gabriel Anthony Sterling. Mother, Sarah Elizabeth Thorne. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The veins weren't her blood. Reginald was lying about the paternity, a desperate, last-ditch effort to claim the succession clause in the charter. But the seed loan, that part was real. Sarah had taken the $10,000. I realized then that Reginald's father, Harrison I, hadn't given Sarah that money out of the goodness of his heart. He'd given it to her to buy her silence regarding the Motngin Chinmuitarm firm collapse, the collapse that had nearly sent Reginald to prison. Sarah hadn't been a bridge. She'd been a witness. She had used the Vane's own corruption to fund the bank that would eventually grow large enough to swallow them. It wasn't a betrayal of our values. It was the ultimate insurance policy. She hadn't told me because she knew I was too noble to build a life on blackmailed gold. She'd carried that secret for 20 years to keep me clean. I didn't know it yet, I whispered, a cold, vengeful pride swelling in my chest. But Sarah didn't just build a bank. She built a cage, and Reginald just walked right into it. I didn't take the truck. I took the stairs to the basement, moved a heavy workbench, and opened a door to the alleyway that the reporters didn't know existed. 10 minutes later, I was in a nondescript Toyota Camry I kept for invisible errands, weaving through the side streets of Bridgeport toward the Loop. The city felt different now. The skyscrapers weren't symbols of achievement anymore, they were targets. I arrived at Daly Plaza just as the sun began to dip behind the canyon of buildings, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. The crowd of reporters had grown, a sea of cameras and microphones pressing in on the podium. Reginald Vane was still there, standing next to Maya, his hand on her shoulder in a grotesque parody of grandfatherly affection. Maya looked like she was in a trance, her face a mask of pale marble. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouts of, "Mr. Sterling, over here," and Gabriel, "Is it true?" I didn't stop until I was at the foot of the podium. Reginald saw me, and his smile didn't falter. It widened. "Ah, Gabriel," Reginald said, his voice amplified by the bank of microphones. "The man of the hour. Or should I say, the man of the past. I was just telling your daughter about her true heritage, about how the Vane family has been the silent partner in every success you've ever had." "Get your hand off my daughter, Reginald," I said, my voice steady, carrying through the cool evening air with a weight that silenced the nearest reporters. "Your daughter?" Reginald laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "She's a Vane in spirit, if not by your name. She has the instinct for power. She's the one who brought the evidence against Silas, didn't she? She has our blood in her veins, the blood of people who know how to survive. She has the blood of a woman who saw your father for the thief he was," I countered, stepping up onto the platform. I was inches from him now. I could smell the expensive gin on his breath and the desperation beneath his cologne. "You think that $10,000 was a loan? You think your family owns Sterling Capital because of a succession clause? The charter is clear, Gabriel. I have the original documents. My lawyers are at the state's attorney's office as we speak. By Monday, the Sterling name will be erased, and the Vane banner will fly over your headquarters." Maya looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a sign, a hope. I reached out and took her hand, pulling her away from him. Her fingers were no longer ice cold. They were trembling with a simmering, righteous fury. "You're right about one thing, Reginald," I said, turning to the cameras. I didn't look like a poor man from Bridgeport anymore. I looked like the man who had spent 25 years learning exactly how to destroy people like him. "The charter is clear, but you forgot to read the High-In Lair My High Amendment, the one Sarah filed after your father died." Reginald's eyes narrowed. "What amendment?" "There was no amendment. The legacy indemnification clause," I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. "It states that any seed capital sourced from entities later convicted of financial crimes or racketeering is automatically reclassified as reparational assets and stripped of all voting and succession rights. It means that because your father was posthumously implicated in the Motngin Chintrum Chinmui Tarm firm collapse, thanks to a dossier Sarah left in a private vault, his loan wasn't an investment. It was a court-ordered forfeiture." The silence in the plaza was absolute. The reporters were frozen, their pens hovering over notebooks. Reginald's face went from triumphant to a sickly, mottled gray. "You're bluffing. My father was never convicted." "Not while he was alive," I said. "But Julian just opened the vault, Reginald. He just found the signed confession your father gave to Sarah in exchange for her not going to the feds in Chinmui Tarm. He admitted to the embezzlement. He admitted to the fraud. And he admitted that the $10,000 was a bribe to keep the Vane name out of the headlines." I leaned in closer, my voice a whisper that only he and the nearest microphones could hear. "You don't own my bank, Reginald. You don't even own your house. Because as of 5 minutes ago, I didn't just call in your debt. I turned over your father's confession to the IRS. They're going to look at 25 years of legacy wealth and see 25 years of tax evasion and money laundering." Reginald tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the cameras, at the city he thought he owned, and realized he was standing on a trapdoor. "And as for Maya," I said, turning to my daughter, "she's not a Vane. She's a Sterling, and she's the new CEO of Sterling Capital." Maya stepped forward, the shock in her eyes replaced by a cold, brilliant light. She looked at Reginald, then at the cameras. "My father is right," she said, her voice echoing across Daly Plaza. "The Vane family isn't a legacy. It's a parasite. And today, the host is fighting back." What happened next changed everything. Reginald didn't collapse. He didn't run. He did something much worse. He started to laugh. A low, hysterical sound that rose into a cackle. "You think a piece of paper saves you, Gabrielle?" Reginald wheezed, clutching his chest. "You think you can just amend your way out of the truth?" Look at the girl, Gabriel. Look at the girl. He pointed a shaking finger at Maya. If Sarah was so noble, why did she spend the last year of her life meeting with me in secret? Why is there a second trust fund, Gabriel? One that isn't in your name. One that isn't in the bank's name. A trust fund for the hair of Vane that Sarah funded with sterling profits for a decade. I felt the world tilt again. Maya froze. The reporters surged forward, sensing a new, even darker twist. I didn't know it yet. I whispered, the coldness returning to my heart. But the hidden truth wasn't about the money. It was about the one thing I never thought Sarah was capable of. A plan that didn't include me. Reginald pulled a small, leather-bound diary from his coat pocket, the same blue cover Julian was looking for. But Julian was at the bank. This was the real one. Sarah didn't hate us, Gabriel, Reginald hissed, his eyes bright with a dying, vengeful light. She was one of us. She knew the only way to truly protect Maya was to make her the master of both worlds. She didn't build a cage for me. She built a throne for her daughter. And the price of that throne was you. I looked at Maya, and for the first time, I saw the doubt in her eyes. The seed of suspicion had been planted. The reversal was total. I had saved the bank, but I was losing the only thing that mattered. Dad? Maya whispered, the words sounding like a plea. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I looked at Reginald, at the diary, and at the flickering lights of the city. My revenge plan had begun, but the enemy wasn't just the Vanes anymore. It was the memory of the woman I loved. And as the first drops of a cold Chicago rain began to fall, I realized that to save my daughter, I might have to destroy her mother's ghost. The rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the Loop and turned the pavement of Daly Plaza into a mirror of the gray sky. Reginald Vane stood there, clutching that blue leather-bound diary like it was a holy relic, a smirk of pure, distilled malice on his face. He thought he had won. He thought that by casting a shadow over Sarah's memory, he could reclaim the throne I had spent 25 years building. Maya was looking at me, and the look in her eyes was one I'll never forget. It wasn't just doubt. It was the look of someone whose entire world had just been revealed as a stage play. She didn't know who to believe, the father who had kept her in a humble bungalow while sitting on billions, or the man who claimed her mother was a secret architect of the very dynasty we were trying to destroy. "Read it, Reginald," I said, my voice cracking through the sound of the rain. "If you're so sure that diary is the key to my daughter's soul, read the last entry. Read the one Sarah wrote the week she died." Reginald's smirk faltered. He fumbled with the pages, his expensive leather gloves slick with water. The reporters surged forward, the boom mics hovering like vultures. He found the page, his eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script I would know anywhere. He started to read, his voice losing its confident, booming resonance. "October, muy bornth," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Reginald thinks the meetings are working. He thinks the $10,000 his father gave me was a seed for a partnership. He thinks the Hair of Vane Trust is a bridge for Maya to return to the fold. He is a fool. He sees the thorn name and thinks of a victim. He doesn't realize that a thorn is only useful because of its ability to protect the rose." Reginald stopped. He looked up, his face pale. This doesn't make sense." "Keep reading, Reginald," Maya said, her voice like a sudden crack of thunder in the quiet plaza. She stepped toward him, the black fabric of her dress whipping in the wind. "Read the part about the trust fund." Reginald's hand was shaking now. "The trust fund for the Hair of Vane is not a gift. It is a vacuum. Every dollar of consulting fees Silas Vance sends to the Vanes is being funneled into a short sale position against Vane Logistics. I am not building a throne for Maya. I am buying the ropes that will hang the House of Vane. By the time they realize the money is gone, they won't just be bankrupt. They will be owned by the very girl they tried to exploit." The silence that followed was absolute. The reporters didn't even breathe. I looked at Maya, and the warmth flooded back into my chest. Sarah hadn't betrayed me. She hadn't been one of them. She had been a ghost in their machine, a silent assassin, who had spent 20 years letting the Vanes think they were winning, while she systematically dismantled their future from the inside out. She didn't fund a trust for an heir. She created a legal black hole that had been slowly sucking the Vane legacy dry for 2 decades. "I didn't know it then," I said, looking directly into the lens of the lead camera, but Sarah didn't want me to know because she wanted me to be the heart of this family. She took the dirt so I could stay clean. She took the Vanes' money and used it to build the bank that would eventually provide loans to the very people the Vanes looked down on. I turned back to Reginald. "The succession clause you're so proud of? It's real, but according to the High In Lair Mui High Amendment Sarah filed, the heir of Vane is defined as the person who holds the controlling interest in the Vane Logistics short sale. And that person is currently standing right next to you. Maya reached out and snatched the diary from Reginald's trembling hand. She didn't look at it. She looked at him. You're done, Reginald. The IRS has the confession. The feds have your son. And now, I have the house. She turned to the cameras, the rain-slicked Chicago skyline reflecting in her eyes. My name is Maya Sterling. And as of this moment, Sterling Capital is initiating a total liquidation of all Vane family assets to satisfy the reparational clause of our charter. The proceeds will be used to establish a citywide scholarship fund for the children of the very neighborhoods Harrison Vane III called service class. The plaza erupted. The reporters swarmed Reginald, who looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He tried to speak, to yell about lawyers and injunctions, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the city. He was a relic, a hollow man whose secret weapon had just turned into his executioner. As the police moved in to escort him away, not for protection, but for questioning regarding the new evidence Julian had found in the vault, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Maya. "Dad?" she said, her voice soft now, the hardness of the CEO persona melting away for just a second. "Yeah, honey? Can we go to Vito's now? I'm really hungry." I laughed, a real deep laugh that felt like it was clearing 25 years of dust from my lungs. "Yeah, Maya, let's go home." 3 weeks later, the dust had finally settled, though the headlines in the Tribune were still buzzing. Harrison Vane III had been sentenced to 12 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. Silas Vance had taken a plea deal, turning over a decade's worth of evidence against the Vane family's offshore network in exchange for a reduced sentence. The Lake Forest estate had been sold at auction to a nonprofit that specialized in housing for veterans. I was sitting in my usual booth at Vito's in Bridgeport. The red-checkered tablecloth was stained with a bit of marinara, and the air smelled like garlic and home. Maya was across from me, looking through a stack of loan applications for small businesses in the neighborhood. She was the new face of Sterling Capital, and under her leadership, the bank was finally becoming the institution Sarah and I had dreamed of, in that tiny office above the laundromat. "You know," Maya said, looking up from a folder, "Sarah Thorne's mother called me today. Evelyn. How is she? She's moving back to Chicago. She said she's tired of being invisible. I offered her a job in our compliance department. She's probably the only person in the city who can spot a Vane-style fraud before it even starts. That's a good move, Maya." Sarah would have liked that. The door to the restaurant opened, and a young man walked in. He was wearing a delivery uniform, looking tired but determined. He walked up to the counter and started talking to Vito about a bulk order for a community center down the street. He didn't have a gold watch. He didn't have a bespoke suit. He just had a job to do and a family to provide for. I watched him for a moment, then looked back at my daughter. "Do you ever regret it? Knowing the truth? Knowing that the money was always there?" Maya took a sip of her soda and looked around the humble restaurant. "I regret that Mom had to carry that weight alone. But I don't regret the bungalow, Dad, and I don't regret the truck. Because if I'd grown up like Harrison, I would have been the person standing on that podium in Daly Plaza, losing everything because I thought I was better than the people who built the world." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You gave me something better than a trust fund, Dad. You gave me a foundation that didn't need a character clause to hold it up." My phone buzzed on the table. It was a news alert. Final Vane asset liquidation complete. Sterling Scholarship Fund reaches $1 million milestone. I smiled and put the phone away. The revenge was complete, but it didn't feel like a victory of one family over another. It felt like a restoration. The Vanes had spent a century trying to build a wall between themselves and the rest of Chicago. We had just used the stones from that wall to build a bridge. "What's the moral of the story, Dad?" Maya asked, a playful glint in her eyes. "The one you're going to tell the grandkids one day?" I thought about it for a second, looking at the vibrant, working-class heart of Bridgeport through the window. "The moral," I said, "is that in this city, and in this life, you never underestimate the man who looks harmless. Because the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones with the loudest voices or the biggest bank accounts. They're the ones who know exactly who they are and exactly what they're willing to do to protect the people they love. And the ones who drive 20-year-old trucks," Maya added with a grin. "And the ones who drive 20-year-old trucks," I agreed. As we finished our dinner and walked out into the cool Chicago evening, I looked up at the stars peeking through the city's glow. I felt Sarah there, in the wind off the lake and the hum of the neighborhood. She had played the most dangerous game of all, and she had won. She had saved us, but more importantly, she had taught us how to save ourselves. The Vanes were gone, a footnote in the history of a city that has no room for the entitled. But the Sterlings? We were just getting started. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just taking everything from your enemies. It's building something so good, so real, and so enduring that they become irrelevant. And as I watched Maya climb into her own modest SUV, ready to head back to the office to build a future for someone else's daughter, I knew that the legacy was finally in the right hands. Trust me, you never know who is sitting across from you. They might be a bank employee, a dock worker, or a tired father in a faded jacket. But if you treat them like they're less than you, be careful. Because you might just be handing them the keys to your front door, and they might just decide to change the locks.